Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with special guest, Dr. John C. Brady, who's here to share with us his new book, Psychological DNA, a cold case analysis of who killed Robert F. Kennedy. So Dr. John C. Brady II is a psychologist and criminologist who received his education at the University of California, Berkeley, where he received his doctorate degree in criminology. After graduating, he served psychological internships at the San Francisco VA Hospital and the Highland General Hospital in Oakland, California. As both a California licensed forensic psychologist and a doctor of criminology, he brings a unique blend of professional knowledge and years of experience to each case he is involved in. So let's welcome to the show Dr. John C. Brady.
Thanks, Marianne. I'm looking forward to these moments.
Well, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your book, Psychological DNA. I mean, what an interesting time. Here we're talking about a political assassination, and just recently we had a political assassination attempt.
Yeah, and that's particularly true concerning what happened with Donald Trump. So the genesis of me getting into the Sirhan case was based on why did he shoot Senator Kennedy, and the same question can be made with this Thomas Crooks person. Why did he shoot at Donald Trump? There's a commonality there, and that's what my career pretty much has been, is to trace down what are the motivational factors involved in people who commit serious crimes, including homicide. And specifically in the Sirhan case, it's why did he fire shots at Senator Kennedy?
Well, we know that you have such a unique and fascinating background. So with the Sirhan case, how did this even get on your radar, and how did you decide that this was a case that you were going to investigate?
That's a good question, because when I was a graduate student at Berkeley in the School of Criminology, back in the day, my senior advisor and mentor was the psychiatrist that was the head of the defense team in Sirhan's case, Bernard Diamond. So Bernard Diamond and other select graduate students, including myself, would have conferences with Dr. Diamond concerning the dynamics of Sirhan and where the defense was going in the case. So I developed an interest in that particular case, and then years later, when I went back over the notes and the information that I have researched, I found that there were a lot of mistakes that were made during the trial, probably not based on Dr. Diamond's ineptitude, but just based on other factors that produced a result that wasn't very satisfactory, in that Sirhan was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death.
So what was the defense's approach to this?
I think that the entire book really can be boiled down to 3 or 4 key points. First point is that in doing this psychological DNA, which is the title of the book, this derives from a reanalysis of the entire case going back to 1968. It's a re-diagnosis of the diagnoses that were made at the time that Sirhan was assessed. During that time, there were critical mistakes made which worked against Sirhan getting a fair trial. For example, just the transcript of the trials is 6,000 pages. That had to be gone through, and then the notes from Dr. Diamond that I took years ago, plus all of the other information and the research that's been done since, I had to sort of compile and put into this psychological DNA, which is really kind of like when you go to the medical doctor and they do x-rays and they're checking for something, perhaps a cancer diagnosis, and you want a second opinion. So you send that x-ray to a second oncologist. The second oncologist will review it. And that's really what psychological DNA is. It's a reanalysis of all those facts, some which were missed during the trial, that come to bear on what happened to this 24-year-old disenfranchised Arab who had been accused of being Palestinian freedom fighter, and a lot of scurrilous statements were made against him, not the least of which were racial in nature.
So, do you suspect that there would be some parallels between Sirhan Sirhan's case and possibly Thomas Matthew Crook's?
The information on Crooks is so sketchy at this point that we really don't know what motivated him. With Sirhan, the important factor is the reanalysis of what his real diagnoses were. This was a man who was completely committed to Robert Kennedy, who made statements that he was his hero. He almost loved this man. He admired him. And Sirhan had transferred his allegiance from President Kennedy to Robert Kennedy. Then suddenly something happened in Sirhan's mental state that made him change, and he suddenly saw Kennedy as an adversary. So he switched his opinion of Kennedy from one of fondness to one of that he had to be eliminated. Okay, the elimination issue really goes towards what were the real diagnoses of Sirhan. The diagnosis that I think comes the closest is that he had a multiple personality that was developed early in his life, probably at age 11 or 12, when he lived in Palestine. He carved out this second personality, which ensued for 24 years. In that personality, he had accumulated a lot of negativity based on what he saw in Palestine, which is no different than the Gaza war that's going on now. He saw people maimed, he saw people murdered. His brother was killed in Palestine, in East Palestine, that became Jordan. So he was severely traumatized. And in order to escape this trauma, as traumatized children, popular literature now shows that traumatized people can take a number of routes to create an escape route to prevent further trauma. But really, what happens is sometimes they closely identify with the oppressor and they create a separate personality which is capable of engaging in violence. This is what I think happened to Sirhan, is that he created the separate or multiple personality, it was called at the time. Today it has a different name. It's called dissociative identity disorder. But at the time, many of the doctors, and Sirhan saw 10 doctors, many of those doctors had kind of gone around the edges of multiple personality. And because it was a controversial diagnosis, Dr. Diamond told me that he was kind of reluctant to really go into this as a defense, although he would allude to the fact that Sirhan did have a dissociative reaction. This reaction was verified by a number of the other doctors, including Dr. Richardson and Dr. Shore, and later by a doctor at San Quentin when he interviewed Sirhan when he was on death row. The multiple personality disorder was so hot and so controversial, later based on a case that I'm sure, Marianne, you remember, which was Sybil. Sybil was a well-known case, but it was a complete fraud. Sybil was disproved as a case where these three women got together and they decided that they wanted to become rich and famous, and that's exactly what happened to them. But at the expense of this poor patient who was cajoled into the feeling that she had multiple personalities. So all of this was surrounding the Sirhan case. Although Sybil came 10 years later, there was still considerable controversy about making this particular diagnosis. Dr. Diamond was well aware of that. The original case, or one of the original cases that pinpoint multiple personality, of course, was the Three Faces of Eve, which was 10 years before the 1969 case with Sirhan. The Three Faces of Eve was a legitimate three-personality case done by two doctors from Kansas. So there was some evidence that could be presented to the jury. And speaking of, the jury was so inundated with what they called psychobabble at the end of the trial that they kind of just threw up their hands and said, we don't understand this. We can't figure this out. This guy shot Robert Kennedy. He's going to be convicted. So the psychiatric defense really was not well articulated, and each of the doctors kind of had a different perspective on what Sirhan's real diagnosis was.
So, in your view, what do you think was wrong with him?
I think that, as I said before, one of the characteristics of a condition called erotomania, which is a newer diagnosis that wasn't available in 1969. Erotomania is as I described before, it's the initial connection to a person or to people in almost a love situation where suddenly something happens in that relationship and then they turn negative. In I think chapter 4 of the book, I talk about several cases, including Mark David Chapman, who as you know, shot John Lennon. Now, before Mark David Chapman shot John Lennon in the back 4 or 5 times at the Dakota in New York, right across from Central Park, he had adored Lennon. He was one of Lennon's biggest supporters. He had all of you have to just sort of see how this guy's mind works. He had all of Lennon's records. He had a recording studio like Lennon in Hawaii. He had a band like Lennon. He married a Japanese woman like Yoko Ono. So he was completely transcended into this identification with Lennon. When Lennon said that the Beatles were more important than Jesus, Chapman, who was a fundamentalist Christian, absolutely drifted into this separate personality, and he saw Lennon as his enemy. Ergo, he shoots him after he signed his latest album in New York City for Chapman. So that's one example, one analogy of what happened to Sirhan. He had deposited all of this positive information into this personality. Then suddenly, when Robert Kennedy publicly announces in Beverly Hills that he's going to support the Israeli cause and send bombers to Israel to bomb the Palestinians, Palestinians are his people. They're Sirhan's people. He couldn't stand the stress of this. His affinity for Kennedy suddenly turns to hate in this second personality, and he ends up shooting Robert Kennedy, and inexplicably, probably to him still today, that he doesn't realize what happened. As I said, there were several doctors, including one very famous doctor, Dr. Brown at Harvard, who re-verified the diagnosis of a dissociative reaction. But again, he was kind of reluctant to go all the way to make the definitive diagnosis of, let's just call it a multiple personality type. But there was something happening to make Sirhan, just like Mark David Chapman, split off from his ordinary reality and to create the second personality, which was devastating and harbored all these ill feelings, displaced onto Kennedy in Sirhan's case. But the feelings had welled up in Sirhan from the time that he saw the Palestinian war. He saw war crimes. He saw body parts on the street. As I said, his brother was killed, run over by a military truck. So he was deeply traumatized his entire life, leading to him being in the Ambassador Hotel and taking out what his second personality perceived really as this evil person who he once loved.
Earlier, you mentioned that you had gone over the case and made a reassessment. What do you feel about his case now?
That's a good point. I think that that's part of the psychological DNA is to go over all of the testing. So I re-examined all of the psychological testing that was given to Sirhan. As a forensic psychologist, I mean, that's in my wheelhouse. So I was very interested to reinterpret and see if there was something missed in the assessment by the basically two psychologists with other review psychologists that looked at their work. There were a number of themes that were missed, leading to kind of the misdiagnosis of Sirhan as being a psychotic, paranoid schizophrenic. There is no evidence from any doctors who interviewed Sirhan that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. Maybe paranoid a little bit based on suspiciousness that Kennedy was going to maybe kill his people, but there was no overt signs of a psychotic condition working. The psychotic paranoid schizophrenic diagnosis was a safe diagnosis, terribly misused during the 1960s. Everybody that was seen in a mental hospital or sometimes on an outpatient basis that had a variety of symptoms was classified with a garden variety schizophrenic diagnosis. It was problematic then, it's still problematic today. The real diagnosis then is his erotomania, his switching of his mindset with Kennedy from one that is very favorable to one which is negative and leading to his demise. One of the interesting linchpins in this case, Marianne, is Sirhan's diary. We've all heard about Sirhan's diary. Books have been written about it. It's a very interesting document that I also reanalyzed and discussed with Dr. Diamond in seminars at Berkeley. This diary includes a lot of inculpatory or statements that incriminate Sirhan. If he was in front of me, I would blast him. He's not to be trusted. So he made these statements after he made previous statements concerning how much he professed his affiliation and admiration for Kennedy. These statements made in the diary naturally attracted the attention of the prosecution, who alleged during the trial, presenting this as evidentiary information, that this is proof positive that this guy should be convicted of first degree murder. Look what he said in the diary. You know, he's betrayed me. The diary was obtained from Sirhan's private effects without a search warrant, with no approval, and it was introduced into evidence anyway during the trial by the prosecution, who thought this would convince the jury further that Sirhan was a premeditated murderer who planned this situation. Judge Walker let this information in, and the defense, not only did they not object or make motions to exclude this diary, they enhanced the position of the prosecution by entering more information concerning the diary's negative statements and statements that could convict Sirhan. The defense team, without Dr. Diamond's approval, by the way, thought that yes, we can enter into the record these crazy statements by what we consider a crazy person, and this will help our case. It was so bizarre that looking back at the case, I can't believe that the defense would make this kind of a decision to allow evidence against their own client. Everybody wasn't on the same page, so they weren't coming up with the diagnosis of a multiple personality. They did not entertain or understand the notion of what erotomania was. They didn't understand how traumatized that Sirhan was, and he possibly had created the second personality. So they really didn't put together a composite picture of the mind of a murderer, and that's what I tried to do during the past 50 years, is to reconstruct what happened to Sirhan based on the theory of psychological DNA, which is an X-ray of his mental state based on all the factors that went into his trial and convicted in April of 1969.
What would you like readers and our listeners to take away from psychological DNA?
That's a good point. I think that important thing is to look at the framework that we can use and apply to other criminal cases, whether it's Charles Manson, whether it's Mark David Chapman or other people, that we have a set of guidelines that can help us to achieve a better understanding of what makes these people tick. So that would go to Thomas Crook's case once we have more information concerning his mental state. Obviously, that's going to be a key factor after the fact, because we want to know what led him up to that point that he had a K-47 223 gun pointed at the presidential candidate. The information that I would like to convey to the readers or to the listeners is that once you put together a grid such as a psychological DNA model, then you can have some reference points to understand, why did these people engage in this behavior? What drove them to this particular point? Were they just guilty, or were they malingering or lying? In the book, I go into the Hillside Strangler case, which was a very interesting case of two men that murdered about 12 women in Los Angeles and in Seattle. One of them tried to use a multiple personality defense, which was his invention of a second personality. So it's important to be able to discern between those patients who have a legitimate disorder, like Sirhan did, and those people who malinger or try to create a personality type that will relieve them of culpability, such as the Hillside Strangler case.
Well, Dr. Brady, I mean, your work is so fascinating. Where can our readers and listeners connect with you and learn more, not just about this book, Psychological DNA, but all of your other books as well?
Oh, that's great. Marion, they can go to John C. Brady, PhD. That's my website, and my books are there. And they could buy the book at all the booksellers, Barnes and Noble, Thrift Books, Walmart, and then particularly with the publisher, which is Trine, Trine, Day, Day, one word, or Amazon. So, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to get some of this information out concerning still a very complex and controversial case, even 50 years after Sirhan has been sitting in a state prison.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brady. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Psychological DNA. If you'd like to connect with Dr. Brady, you can at his website, johncbrady.com, for more information on this book and all of his other books. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.